If you want to weaponize, politically weaponize the IRS for your preferred policy outcomes, you're going to undermine the credibility of the IRS in enormous ways. It's terrible for all sorts of good government reasons. And no one wants to concentrate on that because instead they want to use it as a talking point about how we need to soak the rich for all of their wealth.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the show. I've got a great guest to bring to you today, Jonah Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Dispatch and host of the Remnant podcast. Jonah, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hey, it's great to be here.
So I asked you to come on the show because I saw a great column you wrote about this so-called scandal based on this report by ProPublica. So for people who haven't heard, they published a treasure trove of leaked IRS documents that purport to show some of the wealthiest people in America getting away with paying very little in taxes. But just to kind of set things up for the audience, can you just give us a general impression of what the bombshell was supposedly all about?
Yeah, this is actually one of the better examples in recent years. This happens every now and then when there's some journalistic expose or revelation that, in fact, confirms something that everybody knew and had been talking about for a very long time. I remember Jane Mayer once had this bombshell that the Koch brothers were involved in politics. Something that, like, one of the Koch brothers ran for vice president of the United States 20 years before the article. This was not shocking news, but similarly, this ProPublica piece collects the tax returns of the 25 richest Americans and reveals that they don't pay an enormous amount in income taxes as relative to their overall wealth. Because, shockingly enough, most people who are worth billions of dollars don't get it from a salary. You have to check my math here, but I'm pretty sure it's something like, if you were worth $1 billion from your salary, you'd be getting a check of, like, I want to say $19 or $29 million a week. And that's not how companies compensate people. Most people are wealthy because they own stocks or other assets, real estate, whatever, businesses that are worth something on paper, but you never know what they're really worth until you try to sell them, because that's the way prices work. So anyway, but this is something that people have been talking about forever. This was the centerpiece of the Occupy Wall Street moment. You know, how the 1% don't pay it enough and blah, blah, blah. Warren Buffett has been getting mileage over the fact that his secretary pays a higher tax rate than he does, which I'm not sure is actually true. It depends how you do the math. And Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, they ran in 2020 and Sanders in 2016 based on this premise that everything that your heart desires could be paid for if we just taxed the wealth of millionaires and billionaires, or their 1%. This has been talked to death. All this did was lay out in concrete terms how it works for some billionaires. There's nothing shocking. Anybody who's followed this stuff was not shocked by what was in it in any broad terms. There's no crimes or anything like that. And the thing that bothers me about it is that, you know, the real scandal isn't confirming what everybody knew. The real scandal is that this had to have come almost surely from the IRS itself. It's not quite the same thing as Donald Trump's tax returns, which a lot of people want to compare it to. First of all, Donald Trump was president of the United States. Second of all, Donald Trump campaigned for president, promising to release his tax returns. Donald Trump also claimed that he was qualified to be president of the United States because of his brilliance at business and his generosity in terms of philanthropy. So that, to me, is like in those courtroom dramas, you open the door, counselor. That seemed to me fair game. And moreover, my understanding is most of it did not, in fact, couldn't be traced to an IRS leak. There's no way on earth you could get the tax returns over many years of the 25 richest people in America by individually reporting it out per, like those guys, I think by definition, have very good tax attorneys and accountants. And the idea that you're going to get all of them to basically get themselves either disbarred or thrown in jail for doing what they do and lose their careers and their livelihoods by leaking it is very unlikely. Could be a computer hack, but there's no reason as of yet to believe that's true. And if it was a computer hack and the IRS isn't saying so, that's another scandal. So it had to be leaked by someone with access to this inside the government. And that is outrageous on all sorts of levels. If you want to weaponize, politically weaponize the IRS for your preferred policy outcomes, you're going to undermine the credibility of the IRS in enormous ways. It's terrible for all sorts of good government reasons. And no one wants to concentrate on that because instead they want to use it as a talking point about how we need to soak the rich for all of their wealth.
Yeah, I think that is definitely the bigger scandal here. The Wall Street Journal had a good editorial where they were like, that's the real scandal. Because to me, when I saw this ProPublica report, I know you and I were both free market folks, so I don't think that a lot of these deductions and loopholes in the tax code should actually even exist.
Sure.
But they do, right? And the point is that everyone knows rich people have armies of accountants. What is the news value in this story even?
Yeah, the only news value is in insofar as ProPublica, to their credit, is pretty honest about this. They basically they want to change public policy, and so they want to shine a light on how these people organize their finances. And but you could have made the same argument without divulging their tax returns, because we knew this was true. If you had interviewed all 25 of them, they would all say, yes, this is true. I pay much less in income taxes because I most of my wealth comes from owning stocks or businesses or real estate or whatever. And so it's really just to lend aid and comfort to the cause of a wealth tax. And the dishonesty of the ProPublica piece is that it sort of owns it, which is kind of, weirdly honest in a dishonest kind of way, where they conflate the increase in the value of people's, or the increase in people's wealth, the value of their stocks or whatever, with income. And then they say, look, they're not paying income taxes on this increase in wealth, but we do not tax wealth for all sorts of reasons, constitutional, pragmatic, whatever. The analogy I use is, let's say you have a wedding ring. Let's say it's a really nice wedding ring. Let's say there's now the price of gold goes through the roof. Should every year I be taxed on the nominal paper value of my wedding ring, even though I have no intent on selling it? That is just confiscatory seizing of money without, any justification for it. And the presumption here is that somehow if your wealth increases, that you're living off of your wealth in ways that are equivalent to income. And that's just not true.
Yeah, and I found it interesting because it fundamentally, the point of the report was to push for a wealth tax, right? They're showing people's changes in wealth and saying they're not paying enough income taxes. It's like saying, look, they bought an expensive car and they're not paying enough property tax on their house. It's like they're two different things. One of the billionaires actually replied and was like, yes, I pay little in income tax because I have very little income.
Right.
But the question, ultimately you're right. The point is to push for a wealth tax. And this is a bigger question about Elizabeth Warren and Bernie. But one of the things you wrote about in your column was just the idea of taxing wealth itself is something that I think, unfortunately, most people would say, oh, yeah, I don't care if billionaires have to pay a 2% wealth tax. It sounds like Elizabeth Warren makes it sound very small. It's not, but that requires some math. But you talked about it, I think, in terms of baseball cards. And I thought that, can you just talk to us about why wealth itself should not be taxed just fundamentally?
Sure. First of all, there's a constitutional issue which gets complicated. You literally would have to I think you'd have to amend the Constitution to be able to tax wealth, because the income tax was unconstitutional until we amended the Constitution, just the way it's written about how taxes should be levied based on population, yada, gets complicated. But just there's that. But more broadly, like the baseball card thing, it's sort of like the wedding ring. If you say you've been collecting baseball cards since you were a little kid, and your baseball card collection is worth a lot of money, but you want to pass it to your kids and your grandkids or whatever, you don't want to sell it. So yeah, it sits in a box in your house and you could be making $50,000 a year as an income, and the thing could be worth $100,000. You're not like living off of the value of your baseball cards. You're not like buying nicer food or cars or going on vacations because you have these baseball cards in your house, because they're technically not worth anything until you try to sell them. And so going around and trying to tax people based upon their wealth, first of all, there's the logistical problem. Do you have some IRS agent with a clipboard walking around people's homes saying, okay, well, I think this couch is worth this amount, let me look in your fridge. Oh, that's a nice, bottle of champagne. That's worth this. You're going to pay 2% on that. Like, that's just not workable on a yearly basis. It's just dumb. Moreover, and this is a point, David Bahnsen, makes really well. He did a piece in commentary a couple of years ago about all this. You're going to have, if we imposed a wealth tax, what people are going to do is respond to tax incentives and change their behavior, change the allocation of their assets. And so a lot of people want to point at stocks and say, well, look what their stocks are worth. Okay, but if all of a sudden you tell people they're going to be taxed on their wealth, they're going to move their assets out of transparent things, which you know the value of, into more opaque, weird things because they want to hide their taxable wealth. And so you're going to get people buying works of art and then getting into big arguments about whether this Picasso is, worth $100 million or $50 million. They're going to be parking their money overseas in weird things. They're going to be doing all sorts of things to lower their tax burden because that's what human beings do. And then there's the problem of, there's so many problems with it. It's sort of like a piñata. You can hit it from any angle and you'll get some reward. But there's also just the fact that you shouldn't tax. Well, where to begin? You shouldn't tax wealth. You shouldn't tax money more than once. So you pay taxes on it when you made an income. You're going to pay taxes when you sell it. You're paying taxes at the point of a transaction, or either when you're selling your labor or where you're selling your property. You don't want the government in the business of deciding what your stuff is worth. And then there's just the general problem is that whenever this has been tried, a bunch of places in Europe tried it. It didn't raise very much money for precisely these reasons. People changed their behavior, changed the allocation of their resources in ways to hide from it. And the places where we do tax this kind of stuff, like in estate taxes, it raises remarkably little money because it turns out that millionaires and billionaires are going to figure out ways to find these loopholes that exist to avoid this. And so, it's sort of dumb on every level. It's unworkable. It won't raise the money that people want. And if you want to come up with I don't want a higher capital gains tax rate, but if they want to come up with one. And so that when people sell their assets, you take a bigger bite out of it. But the fundamental, if you want to get full sort of free market dork on this, I think that the money that these people have in terms of assets, particularly stock, that is a more efficient allocation of resources for productive purposes in the economy. And, we have tax code in this country that incentivizes people to invest in productive things that are going to have a high rate of return. That means new businesses, innovation. It means employing people. It means dynamic economic growth. And the idea that the government knows how to use these resources better, I think, is unproven. And then there's this sort of the fundamental thing, which is that you could one time confiscate the entire net worth. Literally go into people's homes and take their baseball card collections and leave their kids, dressed in sackcloth and just take it all, right? And try and sell it. First of all, you're going to flood the market with really expensive stuff. So the value of it's going to go down and all that kind of thing. But even if you could get top dollar for all of it, just talk to Brian Riedel at the Manhattan Institute about this, it wouldn't come close to paying for all the crap that Bernie Sanders and AOC want. Medicare for all, Green New Deal. And let's say you did it. Let's say you confiscated all the wealth of the top 1%. What kind of economy do you have afterwards? So it's dumb from soup to nuts. It's destined to backfire, but it sounds really good as a talking point.
Well, and maybe that's it, but I have to believe that the people at ProPublica, right, which honestly I generally respect their journalism.
Yeah, I do too, generally, yeah.
It comes from obviously a progressive source, but I've cited them many times. They're fact-based, right? They're investigative reporters. But they have to know that this true tax rate they calculated isn't actually a thing, and the difference between wealth and income. Elizabeth Warren, I disagree with her on everything. She's a very intelligent woman. She knows the difference between wealth and income, but she seizes on things like this to hold hearings and push for the wealth tax. Is it that they actually don't understand this, or do they just don't care? Is it just all kind of a stand-in for the broader, soak the rich ideological movement?
I honestly don't know. I go back and forth on this. There are some people who argue that, sort of like with Biden spending, just load up the debt and then you'll make it impossible to avoid coming up with a VAT or some sort of consumption tax that captures the middle class, and you'll pay for all this stuff later. With the with the anti-rich rhetoric that you get from Sanders and Warren and all these people. My favorite line along these lines comes from actually Bill de Blasio, who, every time he talks about economics, he confirms all the rumors that he smokes a lot of pot, as far as I'm concerned. And when he ran for president, his ad campaign his like go-to line was in his commercials: "There's plenty of wealth out there. It's just in the wrong hands." And which to me is Bolshevik craziness, right? But I think part of it is probably just pure political cynicism as a way to sort of stand out as a more authentic populist and garner support of a certain part of the base. And part of it is trying to figure out a way to change the issue climate where people see wealth as excessive wealth as fundamentally illegitimate. And we'll get to figuring out how to confiscate it somehow. But we'll figure that problem out later. And if they could get, even if it ended up being overturned by the Supreme Court, it would be a massive political victory for these people. If, like Elizabeth Warren's plan of, the 2% of all of your wealth above $50 million, and I think Bernie Sanders is above 32 million, whatever, that's the camel's nose under the tent for establishing this idea that the government can, in one way or another, confiscate wealth for its own purposes. I think it would backfire for all sorts of reasons we talked about, and it's unconstitutional and blah, 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 blah. But it would move the Overton window on taxes in ways that I think they think are worth it on its own. Even, it's sort of like the HR1 election thing. That's a messaging bill. It was never really intended to become law, and they've somehow convinced themselves otherwise. And this is a messaging platform. It is a way of convincing more and more people that people's wealth is on the table, and we'll figure out the details later. I don't know for sure.
Yeah, well, one thing that I'm struck with all this whole conversation is, one, I think it's funny you mentioned the Supreme Court, because they'd pass the wealth tax, it would get struck down because it's unconstitutional. Then they'd say, "See, this is why we need to pack the court."
Right.
Right. But I do wonder. I mean, I wasn't really politically aware in the Tea Party age, but I know that obviously you've been doing this for decades. There was a time where fiscal conservatism was much more ascendant. There are still folks out there, in the Republican Party who speak on it and vote consistently, but they're the minority now, it's safe to say.
Sure.
And some people on this so-called populist right literally cheer things like corporate tax hikes or a wealth tax because they just don't care about free market economics. They think this is woke capital, all of this. I guess, could you speak to the way that the evolution or diversion of the right has really weakened the resistance to this kind of force and allowed it to seep more and more into the mainstream? Because this stuff is only pulling up: wealth tax, socialism, at least, especially among young people.
Yeah. So I think part of it is, everyone likes to talk about right-wing populism. I've written a lot about right-wing populism. I do not like right-wing populism. I do not like populism, generally speaking. But we don't talk enough about left-wing populism. And there's, and historically, I would argue there's probably more left-wing populism in American history than the right-wing populism, but it doesn't really matter. I'm not trying to keep score. We just live in a very populist moment, which says, and the essence of populism is anti-intellectual. It is basically the logic of children, which is, I want it now. I don't care what the arguments against it are. One of my favorite lines comes from William Jennings Bryan, the famous populist of the 19th century, who was led the free silver movement. And he said, "The people of Nebraska are for free silver. Therefore, I am for free silver. I will look up the arguments later." And so there's a real sort of Veruca Salt for the spoiled girl from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, kind of thinking about this. I want it now, right? And when you bake in the sort of envy and sense of entitlement, which I think is a problem in American culture, both on the right and the left, it makes a lot of these things seem more reasonable or more attainable or more desirable. And I think one of the tragedies is that conservatism, rightly understood, and libertarianism, rightly understood, were supposed to be checks against this kind of thing. They were supposed to be, bulwarks against wild-eyed, pandering to the masses kind of economics. And But because, I mean, it's complicated, there are lots of reasons for it, but because of the incentive structure of sort of conservative media, including, Fox News, where I'm a contributor, the clickbait culture of right-wing media on in many quarters, and the philosophical gymnastics and contortions people had to do to reconcile what they thought was conservatism with Donald Trump, you get this populism fueled politics that really just doesn't care about principles and ideas the way it once did. When J.D. Vance is told that, his plan for, regulating social media runs afoul of the First Amendment, he says, I don't care. Right. And for most of my life, the first thing that a conservative would say is, I care a lot about that a lot. And instead it is this pandering kind of tell people what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear kind of thing. And what is a disaster about that is that you can't, if you have a car with 2 gas pedals and no brake, it's going to smash into something. If you have 2 parties that simply do not care about fiscal restraint, even if their lack of concern manifests itself differently, Democrats like spending a lot more than Republicans do, though Republicans spent, enough money to, scald a wet mule, as Haley Barbour used to say, under Donald Trump. But not both sides don't care about debt. Both sides don't care about deficits. And the natural checks and balances of the 2-party system for most of my life have gone out the window, where it is a race to the bottom to see who can pander more to the lowest common denominator when it comes to a lot of these economic policies. And it's going to have to get worse before it gets better, and then people will come to their senses. But I find it very depressing.
So I find all that very interesting. And I very much appreciate the point about 2 gas pedals, right? That's the point of the Republican Party, ostensibly. But I don't know if I'm as down on populism as you are. I think in practice, the manifestations I've seen are very ugly, right? The Bernie Sanders wing, obviously, and then so too the nationalist right can be very ugly in many ways. But voters are in a populist mood, whether we like it or not. Isn't there a way that as, free market people, as libertarian style conservatives, things like crony capitalism, corporate welfare, a bunch of different issues where there are concentrated, powerful elites who rig the system in their favor, is there any way to harness that and have a redeeming version of populism that isn't toxic?
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, it's sort of I'm a broken record on this. I think all poisons are determined by the dose. So, the example I often use when talking about nationalism is it's a lot like salt. If you know anything about cooking, a little salt brings out the flavors of the meal, of the ingredients, that tie them together. It's sort of essential. Too much salt, it kind of ruins the dish. It overpowers everything. And way too much salt is literally deadly. Similar with nationalism, a little nationalism helps the country bind itself together. It gives it a conception of who we are and our sort of emotional attachments to, our historic identity in ways that patriotism doesn't quite capture. Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday, and it's our most nationalistic holiday. But the same thing goes with populism. A little passion is a good thing, even a lot of passion, depending on, where it is. But it's got to be channeled and directed positively. And if you make the passion the most important ingredient, then it's going to be very, very quickly going to go off the rails. And, when I tell people I don't like populism and they say, well, you don't understand, people are really angry. So first of all, I understand people are really angry. I've been hearing from very angry people for a very long time, but I was like that, when was the last time you made your best decisions when you were just wildly, blindly pissed off? When was the last time you really sort of nailed the mature right judgment on something when you were seeing red? And it used to be the job of gatekeepers and intellectual leaders and political leaders in the conservative movement to figure out where the right balance was. Ronald Reagan was very good in terms of tapping into populist sentiment without getting swamped by it. And the last populist movement that I was objectively up on and positive on was the Tea Party movement. I thought, okay, finally, the libertarian prophecies have proven true, and we are going to get a mass movement to march on Washington to demand that they leave us alone, right? And it turned out there were a lot of good people in the Tea Party movement, a lot of serious, decent people. I spoke to a lot of Tea Party groups. I liked a lot of those guys. But the problem was partly because of its passion, and people got addicted to passion. A lot of grifters came in, exploited these people. It got hijacked by a lot of political opportunists that cared more about harnessing people's energy and passion than actually accomplishing things. It got hijacked by a conservative media complex that thought their job is to just constantly feed people new reasons to be pissed off. And it went off the rails. Now, I'm open to the idea that you could figure out the right balance and do that again. And I agree with you. There are plenty of places of concentrated power that I very much would like to see disrupted and overthrown. And a lot of them happen to actually be more on the left than on the right. But that still requires mature, serious leadership that can sometimes tell the mob, hey, guys, calm down. Let's think this thing through. And there's just remarkably little of that going on in our politics today.
Yeah, and that does bring me to so I had the pleasure of being I think I subscribed just after you guys launched to the Dispatch, which, so for listeners who don't know, Jonah is one of the founding editors of the Dispatch. It's been about a year, right?
A little over, but yeah.
So can you just tell people, with all this, we've touched on conservative media, we've touched about the need to be honest with people, about how that influenced your decision to launch the Dispatch and what you hope to achieve, because the link for everybody to subscribe will be in the show notes.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I'm a conservative, been a conservative for a very long time. I have not changed my views on most conservative public policy issues that matter. I used to be very good at a lot of the red meaty smash mouth stuff. And I think, again, all poisons are determined by the dose. I used to think a certain amount of that was pretty useful. I just don't want to be part of a lot of it anymore. And that bothers some people. But Steve Hayes, my partner in all of this, longtime conservative, he's the other Weekly Standard. One of the reasons why we started this was that we found we think that there are good people at all sorts of institutions, and I was at National Review for 21 years. I love those guys. I have lots of friends over there. They do a lot of good work. But as a general proposition, too much of conservative media is either driven by this sort of Steve Bannonite desire to constantly keep people pissed off, to take the worst examples of the other side and say this represents all of them, right? I mean, they hold up Ilhan Omar like a Medusa's head and say, this is what all liberals are like, right? And all liberals aren't like Ilhan Omar. Just like, all conservatives aren't like Matt Gaetz. I mean, you can find, or Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't freaking speak for me in any conceivable way just because she has an R after her name. And then there's also the sort of the business model of a lot of particularly right-wing media, regardless of this sort of, monetizing dopamine clicks by making people angry stuff. There's also just the problem of the clickbait model, where the user experience sucks. You go to a website and you're like, where the frick is that audio coming from? How do I turn off this video? All this kind of crap. It's just annoying, right? Even if it's a good piece, eventually you're just like, I can't find the text because I'm getting crowded out by the pictures of toe fungus or women with abnormally large breasts or whatever, and that kind of thing. And so what we wanted to do was slow things down, take these offer the best versions of on the opinion side, the best versions of conservative opinion and opinion writing. And at the same time, also do something that too few institutions on the right do as a primary mission, which is actually just do reporting. Do reporting that is not designed to piss people off, but is designed to actually illuminate what is going on and provide busy, serious people with information that they actually want to know. And one of the surprising things about this, we've been very successful. We are, it's complicated to say we're profitable, but we are cash flow positive and we have more money in the bank than we raised when we launched the thing. And what we found is there's a lot of goodwill on the right from people who just are turned off by a lot of the noise and the too much muchness of sort of cable news dominated nonsense. But we also get a lot of great feedback from people who are left of center who really disagree with people like me and David French and others on a lot of these fundamental issues, but they're actually just curious to know what a good faith, serious conservative argument is for a conservative position. Because too often the business model for politicians and for a lot of right-wing celebrities these days is to just simply tell right-wing audiences what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. And that creates a certain amount of a bubble. I find these interviews with people who think that, that Donald Trump never had these phone calls about Ukraine, or that, they really believe that the election was stolen and that everybody knows this and all these kinds of things. If you believe a lot of this stuff, it means you're living in a bubble. And a lot of people on the left live in bubbles, to be sure. But what we're trying to do is not be bubble driven, actually try to engage facts on the ground as they exist and take our work from the assumption that we should give our readers the benefit of the doubt that they are serious people and not insult their intelligence. And so far it's working out pretty well.
Yeah, and everybody, there'll be a link to check it out. I've had the pleasure of writing for the Dispatch a few times. I highly recommend it. But now for the most important part of this podcast, Jonah, we ask every guest, and we have gotten some weird answers to just let you know. I've had Steve Forbes told me that he likes to eat peanut butter sandwiches with bacon. I found out that Rand Paul despises mayonnaise, but his wife is constantly sneaking it into his food. So there's a high bar you have to live up to here, Jonah. But what is your controversial or unusual food take?
Okay, so just on the peanut butter and bacon thing, just so you know, I know you're interested in conservative intellectual history and whatnot. William F. Buckley, founder of National Review, was famous for serving at every cocktail party he had peanut butter crackers with bacon. That was his Ritz cracker, peanut butter, bacon. That was his thing. There's a special brand of peanut butter that he used. I feel like I'm going to lose my decoder ring for not remembering what it was, but he was very passionate about that. I wish I had a really mic drop controversial take on food. I'm sure something will come to me the second I walk away from this august podcast, but I think sticking to the mission of the Dispatch, which is sticking close to the truth, even if it's not as provocative as people want it to be, I think I have to say, I think that goat cheese tastes like concentrated death. Basically, I think goat cheese is Satan's toe fungus, and I despise it with all I have in me. Other takes, I guess I could say, well, I like lobster. I do not looking at them. I think crawfish are just basically cockroaches, and they disgust me. But I guess I'll leave it there. If I can think of something in the next 30 seconds, I'll blurt it out. But
all right. I think that covers our bases. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. And Jonah, thanks so much for coming on.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.